Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters. The youngest is just 9 months, the eldest 85. Some 222 people were seized by Hamas on October the 7th as they went on a killing spree through southern Israel, the worst event of its kind in Israeli history. But with Israel now determined to crush Hamas and invade Gaza, any potential negotiations face a terrible dilemma. Our next guest is better placed than most to talk about this crisis. He's Gershon Baskin. Gershon used his own back channels to help release the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit from captivity in 2011. Hello and welcome, Gershon.
Thank you, Nicholas.
It's great to have you with us. Most people watching will know that you've been our resident expert on Israel and Palestine and accompanied our tours here for the last 12 years. And we're going to talk to you about your experience, about this crisis and how you think it should be handled. I do want to mention that at the beginning of this talk, we also have another talk coming up next Wednesday that looks at the risk of contagion. We'll be talking to Nicholas Blanford, who's one of the world's leading experts on Hezbollah. He lives in Beirut, and we're going to be speaking to him next Wednesday at 11 a.m. GMT. That's obviously events depending. So do stay in touch, everyone, and we'll tell you about that talk, which is due to take place next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Gershon, just to start with, these are horrendous, horrific events. Israel has seen nothing like it. 1,400 dead, 222 hostages taken. It's really hard to fathom the impact of this, but can you give us an idea of its impact on Israelis, the psyche, the nation?
Yeah, if you just look at the fact that the largest number of Jews killed in one place at one time since the Holocaust, just imagine the trauma of that. And it's not only the sheer numbers and the brutality and the vicious nature of the murders that took place and who were killed, but also the fact that the belief that we had defense, that we were protected, we had security, collapsed in a few moments where Hamas broke through Israel's defenses with amazing ease. After Israel spending more than $1 billion on building a security fence and walls and electronic surveillance that collapsed with very simple weapons, anti-tank missiles, hand grenades dropped on the Central Command of Electronic Surveillance, created a situation where suddenly, overnight, every Israeli felt insecure. So it's the trauma of the worst thing that's happened to us since the Holocaust, and the loss of a sense of security. That's on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, the events, the results of what Hamas did in Israel has taken the Palestinian cause back 75 years, and the Palestinians in Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank and around the world have a sense of reliving the Nakba of 1948. They are going through their catastrophe. This is the dimensions, the size of the events that are taking place as we speak. Two societies that were traumatized 75, 80 years ago are going through similar traumas today, and we have no idea what kind of societies are going to emerge at the end of this war.
Yeah, at the moment we have roughly 5,000 dead within
I think
Gaza.
it's already above 6,000.
It's already 6,000, yeah. And this is even before the IDF have moved in, as everyone expects them to go in. So truly horrendous death toll there. But I want to focus really on the hostage situation for the moment. That's our main focus here. What is the space given to them within the news? How do they fit in? Because, I mean, I imagine there's this the astonishment that this took place, the horror that is realized at seeing what has happened, has led to a huge anger and a desire really to crush Hamas, which is very understandable. But how do the families and the hostages fit within that?
So I think we have to look at it. It's a short time period. We're talking about basically 2 weeks, but there's been a shift happening in Israeli public opinion. 2 weeks ago, and over most of the last of the 2 weeks, the primary directive of the society of the government and of the army was to get the job done. This is what they've been saying. Something that's been said in Israel with regard to Hamas now for 17 years. Get the job done, and it's always not been allowed to get the job done. We've had these rounds of fighting where at the end there's a ceasefire and we go back to status quo ante and more or less just continue going on. This was part of a strategy, of course. It wasn't by chance. But now the Israeli public felt that there was no way that we could see the end, an end scenario where Hamas is left in place governing and threatening Israel. And the plans were drawn up to make sure that Hamas no longer exists as a movement which is ruling the Gaza Strip and posing a military threat to Israel. And that was the first priority, the first directive. I would say that the recovery of the hostage was clearly at the beginning a second priority. If hostages had to be sacrificed to get the job done, then that was okay. But the hostages' families are now organized and they're public. They've made a lot of noise. There have been former heads of Israeli security, former head of the Mossad, a former advisor on terrorism to Prime Minister Shamir and Rabin, who have come out and said the most amazing things. They said Israel should release every single Palestinian prisoner and get all the hostages back. That includes close to 7,000 Palestinian prisoners, including 599 of them who have murdered Israelis, many of them serving multiple life sentences for killing many Israelis. And you have the former head of the Mossad, Tamir Pardo, who said, release them all to get the hostages back. And the reason that...
So these are not people who are just sort of leftists,
right.
people like you who
These
are
are
more
not
likely to
leftists,
say that kind of thing. These are people who are really part of the security establishment.
I would not even say something like that. And they have come out and said it. And the reasoning is, and it makes sense, is that Israel has a moral responsibility to bring every single one of the hostages back because Israel failed in the primary responsibility of any state, and that's to provide security and protection for its citizens. And Israel failed to protect its citizens, failed to enable the army to protect itself, and it has a moral responsibility first and foremost to bring them back. Now, that's not a majority opinion in the society, but I think that what we have been seeing after 2 weeks of bombing Gaza and 300,000 Israeli reservists called up for duty, and certainly some of them are on the northern border, but the majority of them are in the south, waiting to go into Gaza with all the equipment, all the tanks, all the artillery, all the infantry, fully geared up, trained, and ready with their missions designed and instructed. The army is waiting for a green light to go in. They're ready. But they haven't been given the green light. And it seems to me very clear that the government, because of its moral responsibility, is doing everything possible, is exhausting every possibility to have a negotiation to release at least some of the hostages. Now, Hamas,
so you actually think that negotiations are actually stopping the IDF from going in? So they're actually that's become their immediate priority. You're saying that's what's preventing an invasion of Gaza at the moment?
Yeah, it's not what I think, it's what I know. And this is for sure. There are negotiations taking place. They're taking place with Qatar and Egypt serving as mediators, both in their own world of competing with each other, both in their own world of connections that they have within Hamas, both with their own, cancel that phone, both with their own abilities and motivations, which are different for Egypt and for Qatar. And Hamas has said publicly, and this is very strange also because they announced publicly before they did within the negotiations, that they are prepared to release all the civilian hostages in exchange for a cessation of Israel bombing of Gaza. The definition of who is a civilian is not clear because for Hamas, basically every Israeli is a soldier. But it's clear that we're talking about children, infants, children, elderly people, probably women above the age of 30, although I'm not sure about that. and the rest would be considered by Hamas as being soldiers. Surely, before any deal is reached, Hamas would have to provide a list of names because Israel knows who the 220 people are. I heard today that the number is actually now at 230. The numbers keep going up as they uncover. There's still about 100 bodies that have not been identified yet, and there's a list of more people who are missing. So we don't know the exact number yet, but it's above 220. Israel knows who all those 220 are, and is certainly going to wait for a list from Hamas before they make a deal. But the deal isn't so simple, because we've learned from what was reported in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago that Hamas has also demanded fuel to be brought to Gaza. Israel refuses. According to an early statement made by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees, UNRWA tweeted that Hamas stole the fuel that they had in their warehouses, and then suddenly that tweet disappeared. Obviously, Hamas forced them to remove it, and Hamas is claiming that the hospitals in Gaza will run out of fuel within 24 hours. There'll be no electricity, and a lot of innocent people will die in the hospitals, and that's a human tragedy. Israel says that we know that Hamas stole the fuel, and if the hospitals need fuel, let Hamas provide the fuel to the hospitals. My response to that is that if there's a chance for a hostage release and a ceasefire that will save lives, and if this issue of fuel is what's stopping it, well, there are simple solutions that we can come up with. UN convoys that will accompany fuel trucks to the hospitals and ensure that the fuel gets to the places and stay there and make sure that Hamas doesn't steal them. We can't allow something like fuel trucks to prevent a humanitarian ceasefire and a hostage release. So there was report,
Gershon, I know I would like to remind people, perhaps who don't know your story, of your incredible work to help with the release of Gilad Shalit. And initially, the Israelis had no contact with Hamas, and you established your own contacts via somebody you actually met at a conference, and you built up a personal relationship with this chap who's an academic. And over time, that led to breakthroughs where the Israeli government was not actually talking to anyone associated with the Hamas at the time, and that created momentum. What have you been doing, personally this time around? And people listen to you because they know what you've done previously. So just tell us what you've been doing.
Well, my primary interlocutor in Hamas is this man named Razi Hamad, who at the time that Gilad Shalit was abducted was the government spokesperson and political advisor to Ismail Haniyeh, who was the Hamas prime minister. He later became deputy foreign minister and was also the liaison between the political and military wings of Hamas at the time that I negotiated with him. There are other people in Hamas that I've been in contact with over the years. And since the terrorist attack of October 7th, I've been mainly in contact with Razi Hamad, but also with another person in Gaza who doesn't hold a position today, but he was one of the founders of Hamas, and he's thought to be the elder statesman of Hamas, without mentioning his name. I send WhatsApp messages to a third person who is thought to be the number 2 person in Gaza, only I learned recently that he's actually not in Gaza, he's in Doha. So I've been sending him WhatsApp messages. And I've been sending WhatsApp, and he doesn't respond, but he reads them. And I've been sending WhatsApp messages to another person in Doha, who's one of the most senior people in the Hamas leadership in Doha. He also doesn't respond, but he reads them. The last time I had a phone conversation with him was about 2 years ago. Over the last 17 or 18 years, I've been on and off, officially and non-officially, talking to Hamas.
I missed that last one. When was the last time you had a phone conversation with one of them? I didn't hear that. And who was that?
With the guy who's in Doha about 2 years ago. I speak to Razi Hamad regularly, almost every week for the past 18 years. And we've been chatting mostly on Signal, but also on WhatsApp. And we've had several phone conversations as well over the past 2 weeks.
You've written about some of those contacts. Can you tell you had an initial suggestion for them, and tell me what the reaction was?
Right. My initial suggestion before they started talking about release of hostages for a ceasefire was that I got data from a Palestinian NGO that monitors Palestinian prisoners, Adamir. It's a very reliable source of information, and I got a detailed list of all the Palestinian prisoners in Israel. And I saw that women and minors in Israeli prison who were in sentence and administrative detainees was a relatively small number. There were 43 women prisoners and administrative detainees and 190 minors. These are people 17, 16, 15 years old, mostly convicted for throwing stones or Molotov cocktails at Israelis. To the best of my knowledge, all of them were from the West Bank, not from Gaza. And to the best of my knowledge, none of them had killed Israelis. So what I proposed was to release these women and minors from Israeli prison in exchange for all the women, children, elders, and sick people amongst the hostages. Well, that was the focus of my discussion before it became apparent that Hamas was more interested in a ceasefire than those prisoners. None of those prisoners are any important Hamas people, so they weren't really that much of interest to them. And the focus now has been on the ceasefire in exchange for the prisoner release. And what I have been trying to do with the Hamas people, because I'm not a negotiator today, no one authorized me, no one's appointed me, no one's asked me to negotiate, is what I've been trying to do is make the communication more streamlined. At the beginning, it was mostly Israel talking to the Americans, who were talking to the Qataris, who would talk to the Americans, who would talk to the Israelis, while the Qataris are talking to the Hamas political wing in Doha and in Gaza. Not sure that they're talking to the military wing who are holding the hostages. I've been talking to the Egyptian intelligence, who do have a direct link to the military wing. I put the Hamas intelligence in direct contact with the head of the delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Tel Aviv. Just amazing that they didn't have a direct contact to the Red Cross when the Red Cross were the ones who facilitated the release of the two elderly women. It turns out that at 12:30 the night before that release, I got a phone call from the Egyptian intelligence asking me if I could get them the phone number and the name of the head of the Red Cross delegation in Tel Aviv. Just the world of intelligence.
Yeah.
As Shimon Peres once said, he's not I often quote, but Shimon Peres has said some intelligence things. He once said that our intelligence forces are very good at predicting what happened yesterday.
Yeah. I'd love to get, if people have got questions, please do start putting them down in the Q&A box, and so we can put your questions directly to Gershon. We'll keep talking about the hostages and the negotiations and ideas connected to that. But before that, I do want to talk about the prospect of an invasion in Gaza, and I'm sure that Hamas, we both know Hamas is going to keep, at the very least, anybody with a military background as a hostage for negotiations for after this conflict. There's no way that they're going to release them beforehand. They're too powerful a pawn for them to release. I was reading the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, there was a comparison with Mosul. Prospect of going into Gaza, they say, is worse than the Iraqi army's 9-month fight to defeat the Islamic State in the city of Mosul in 2016 that led to 10,000 civilian deaths. Hamas has 3 to 5 times as many fighters as the Islamic State had in Mosul, and its leadership has had years to prepare. The battle will take place in a dense urban environment and where Israel's superiority will be stymied by guerrilla tactics. Gershon, is it clear to you what you think the IDF can achieve or what they want to achieve in there? And then how do you think the hostages will be treated during that period?
But I think that first, the hostages will all be at risk. There's no question about it. Israel will send in special forces. I'm sure that Israel has spent years studying the underground web of tunnels, as the hostage who was released last night called it, a web of tunnels. She described how they walked for kilometers underground in tunnels. And I'm sure that the Israelis have used all different forms of technology to try and map out the tunnels as the best as they can, using technologies that we can't even imagine. I imagine using artificial intelligence as well. And I'm sure that they have developed tactical weapons to deal with tunnels, including blowing them up, including using robots, including maybe poison gas, who knows what. I'm sure that the Israelis believe that the majority of the openings of the tunnels are in structures. They're not in the fields. I'm sure that there are also tunnel openings in the fields, but they're probably most in structures. That's how they could build them without being discovered. And Israel, I imagine, will be doing what it's been doing in the West Bank in the last months, is going in before the troops go in with these huge bulldozers that remove everything in its way and dig up the ground and will uncover any entrances to tunnels before even the soldiers step foot in the area. But there, no doubt Hamas will have a lot of surprises. There will be booby traps. They will appear out of tunnels that no one knows where they are. And there will be casualties amongst the military. Searching for the hostages will be done by special forces who are trained for that. There will be civilian casualties. This is one of the reasons why Israel has instructed people to leave the north of Gaza, south of Gaza River, and now they've been calling on people to leave Gaza City, and they have said that anyone who remains will be seen as a combatant, simply put as that. They said that there's a safe area in the southwest of Gaza, an area called Moasi, where everyone should go, where there is humanitarian aid, where there is food, where there is water. Israel has opened up water pipelines into the south of Gaza.
I didn't hear that. I didn't know that. When did that?
Apparently they did, because they're encouraging people to go from the north to the south. There's no water in the north. Israel has said there's water in the south. There's food in the south. Humanitarian aid will be going to the south, to the Moasi area, and they're trying to concentrate the population there. I have friends in Gaza who have been telling me we have no place safe to go. I've been telling them that I've heard from the Israelis that you should go southwest, you should go to Moasi. That's what they're saying. I can't imagine that Israel is saying that and then planning to bomb the area. That's just not likely to happen. So they're trying to create a safe zone, and they're trying to clear out as many civilians, non-combatants as they can. And when they go in, it will be very lethal and an enormous amount of firepower, tanks, and they've had weeks to prepare for this. There were 300,000 reservists called for duty, and they've been training over these past 2 weeks and getting equipped. It won't be like the Second War in Lebanon, where units are going in without food, without ceramic vests and helmets, and they're going in fully equipped and fully prepared. It's a very difficult task because for the last decades, the Israeli army was not trained to defend the borders. It was trained to police the occupation. That's what the Israeli army has been doing the past years, protecting settlers and policing Palestinians, not serving as a defense force. But they seem prepared. The army says they're prepared. 2 nights ago, the chief of staff went on television and said, "We are ready." And this was the first time the chief of staff, who also took direct responsibility for the failure of protecting Israel. The military people are taking responsibility, as opposed to our politicians and Netanyahu, who refuse to take responsibility. The military will all resign when this is over, because they have integrity and they can be trusted, as opposed to our politicians.
Yeah. Okay. We've got lots of questions coming in, and we've got 3 questions very related to one another, which are really about what happens after this. And the prospects of peace. We'll come on to that in just a second. Gershon, I am slightly surprised. My background is, as well as working for the New York Times, I also worked for Human Rights Watch, and I worked in Gaza briefly. So I've got some experience of reporting there. And one of the key things in the laws of war is you can't hold a civilian population hostage, and there's an idea of proportionality. So the idea of your strategic objective should not be the action that you should not be disproportionate in their effect on the civilian population. And it would seem to me that cutting off water and electricity is a war crime. Also using artillery on civilian areas is also a war crime, because there's no proportionality on that at all. And our artillery is completely indiscriminate. You send up a shell, it just bursts everywhere. But what I'm slightly shocked by is that, well, I'm not shocked by, I'm more surprised by, you're very much to the left on Israeli politics, very much a peacenik, but it would seem to me that you sympathize with the actions that the IDF are taking.
No, not at all. I'm describing to you what's happening, not that what I support. I think it is a war crime, and right. I think the 1.1 million Palestinians have lost their homes in Gaza. I started out saying, like, this is a Nakba. This is the trauma of 1948. And I don't know how we're going to survive it afterwards, the Palestinian people or the Israeli people. I don't know what proportionality means in response to the horrific terror that took place in Israel. I mean, the Hamas terrorist went to a music and dance festival of 3,000 people and butchered 300 people were killed, young people who were at a music festival. It went into homes and killed whole families. It burned people alive. So I don't know what proportionality means in this case. I know that it is wrong to kill non-combatants. I think it's wrong to kill anyone. I think we shouldn't be killing each other. We should be talking to each other and working this out. But the reality is that we had this brutal terrorist attack, and I think that from what Hamas, I've been talking to Hamas for years about long-term ceasefire arrangements, about modalities in which we could end the siege on Gaza, open up Gaza, and have a long-term ceasefire. I've been appealing to Hamas, with other Palestinians who have been appealing to Hamas to invest their resources in building Gaza and not building rockets. The comment that's coming out of Gaza today from Palestinians is, how is it that in Gaza we're running out of everything? We're running out of food, we're running out of water, we have no electricity, we're running out of medicine. The only thing we're not running out of is rockets. So what is proportionality when you have this kind of regime? I think, as a person who's been negotiating with Hamas for 17 or 18 years, I think Hamas lost its right to exist. I think that Israel cannot allow Hamas to continue to govern Gaza and to continue to threaten Israel. And there's no proportionality ways of doing that. At the end, I don't see a scenario where Hamas is continuing to govern Gaza at the end of this war and threatening Israel. And we can talk about what I call the day after tomorrow, because it's not tomorrow, it'll be the day after tomorrow, that we have to figure out how we're going to live together and rebuild Gaza and rebuild Palestine and rebuild a peace process and change the whole course of events that we've been living for the past 100 years.
Yeah, well, let's come on to those questions now. So we've got three people with three questions. They all overlap, but I want to try and approach them in a distinct way. So let's take Richard Burrows first. Go ahead, Richard. You just need, there you go.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yes, my question, you've pretty well summarized it already, but given Gershon's insights into what's going on, which I must say I found extraordinarily interesting and revealing, that this is not published in newspapers here. We go through this phase that we're in at the moment, we go through all the hostage possibilities until that's exhausted. And then what? What happens then?
Go on, Gershon.
What happens then is that the Israeli incursion into Gaza begins with the goal of trying to rescue as many hostages as possible and dismantling and destroying Hamas. That's what happens. And if the hostages are sacrificed, that's part of the price that Israel will be willing to pay. The majority of Israelis will be willing to pay to get the job done, which is removing.
Gershon, do you think Hamas can be destroyed? Can you give us some understanding of what it is and how it might be destroyed if possible?
Yeah, I think that when we say dismantle or destroy Hamas, we're talking about killing the heads of the military wing of Hamas, all the central command, all the main field commanders. We're talking about 1,000 people. I don't know, more than that, less than that. We're talking about the political leadership of Hamas. The military wing could not have done what it did without the agreement of the political wing of Hamas. So removing all of them and then replacing them.
Just to stay with that, I mean, the parallel with that is the PLO being kicked out of the West Bank, going to Jordan, creating a civil war in Lebanon, and then eventually being moved to Tunis. That took a very long time.
No, we're not talking about that. That is a parallel, perhaps, and the exit of Arafat from Lebanon in '82 is a parallel. But I don't know what the Israelis are planning and what they're thinking. I've already put together a group of thinking Israelis and Palestinians, and we're already talking about the day after tomorrow and what has to happen in Gaza and in Palestine and in Israel in general on the day after tomorrow. And it's more based on what was called the Taif Agreement that put an end to the civil war in Lebanon.
Talking specifically about that, let's bring Javier Master Casas, who's calling in from Barcelona. Go ahead, Javier.
Yes, hello, George. I was in Ramallah a few days ago talking to people in the PLO leadership, people like General Jibril Rajoub. Do you think they have a chance to replace Hamas, to be what they wanted to be from Oslo onwards, and build some kind of opportunity for peace? Because who's going to replace Hamas at the very end of this war?
Yeah, what I think is what I was just saying, is that we need something like a Taif agreement that happened to end the civil war in Lebanon, which is, it's a puzzle with a lot of pieces, but one of the core pieces is a multinational Arab force that will go to Gaza, led by our neighbors, Egypt and Jordan, but with Saudi involvement as well, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, whoever's willing to join in, but an Arab-led force, that there will be immediate elections conducted in Palestine for a new leadership, where the qualification for participating in the elections is the agreement that the emerging state of Palestine will be demilitarized. What happened in Northern Ireland of decommissioning, there will be a process of decommissioning weapons from the society, and that will be tasked to the multilateral Arab force that will be also coordinating with the new Palestinian government that will be elected. And we're talking about deep reforms in Palestine, of basically assuming that Mahmoud Abbas would never agree to leave and never agree to hold elections unless he becomes president for life and becomes the Queen of England, for lack of a better term. But the real power would move to the elected government. I'm not sure that Jibril Rajoub or any of the existing people within the PLO structure would be the ones elected by their people. I think we'll see a whole new set of faces and personalities that we don't know. But for all this to happen, there also has to be an American commitment and an American force on Israel, which will also have a new leadership, because Netanyahu and his regime will not survive what they did. There'll be a day of reckoning in Israel as well. So a political process will need to be established, which, unlike Oslo, will put the end game up front. Whether it's a two-state solution, which is what the international community still adheres to, or some other solution, that will have to be put up front. And any negotiating process will be a process that will lead to that result, not guesswork.
So it has to be underwritten by a very real promise that there will be some kind of state with equal rights for the two peoples that live between the river and the sea.
What I have been stating over and over again in every interview that I've given so far, and I've spoken endless times already on the BBC and other British stations, is that the guiding principle must be one that's very difficult for both Israelis and Palestinians to accept. The guiding principle must be that everyone who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has the same right to the same rights, which is essentially stating that we have to have mutual recognition of our rights to be here. That's the starting point for figuring out how we're going to live together. And for me personally, as someone who supported two states most of my life, I say very openly, I don't care if it's one state, two states, three states, or 10 states. If it's a federation or a confederation or whatever model it is, the basic guiding principle is everyone has the same right to the same rights. And that has to be encased in the international decisions. If it's a two-state solution, then I expect the United States and Britain and the European Union and everyone else who has not yet recognized the state of Palestine to do that. They can say, we will recognize Palestine under conditions A, B, and C when they hold their elections and have a new government. But there can be no more wishy-washy, we support a two-state solution while only recognizing one of those states. So this is a big puzzle. There has to be a huge commitment for a Marshall Plan backed with American money and Arab money and European money to rebuild.
That of course, Gershon, requires some huge political shifts, and not just within, you think about the enormous support that Hamas has had within both the West Bank and Gaza, probably less so now in Gaza, but also within Israeli society. And that leads on to Alan Livingston's question, which is coming up now. Hello, Alan. Open your microphone and put your question to Gershon. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, Gershon, it's good to hear your voice again. I hope you'll visit Houston again sometime soon.
I would love to.
Anyway, my question to you is, what changes do you see in the current political party system in Israel? And do you think that since the October 6th attack, that the people are in a mindset to be able to put something together with the Palestinians that basically offers an equality situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
The bottom line answer to your question, Alan, is that I have no idea. I don't know. But what I do know is that Netanyahu is going to have his day of reckoning. There are people calling him to resign now. There are people who are calling up the example of Chamberlain and Churchill from World War II. That because people say, how can he leave during wartime? And they call up the example of Chamberlain and Churchill during World War II. And there are people who have no confidence in Netanyahu and hold him directly responsible. I want to make clear that I hold Netanyahu responsible not for the collapse of Israel's defenses. There are a lot of people who are talking about that. I hold Netanyahu responsible for directly having a strategy that he has implemented that has removed the Palestinian issue from Israel's political agenda, has enabled Israelis to live in the delusion that we can occupy another people for 56 years and expect to have peace, that have created a delusion that we can encage 2 million people in a fence and walled reality, which is an open-air prison in Gaza, and expect to have quiet. And all this under the guise that we have no partner, because Netanyahu is directly complicit in creating a situation where we have no partner.
Can you talk a bit more about that, Gershon? How has Netanyahu done it? And specifically, I mean, I was reading Haaretz recently, with a very good series of articles talking about how Netanyahu had actually sought to boost Hamas against the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank.
On the Palestinian Authority side, he has delegitimized Abbas, both by name-calling and incitement against him and the Palestinian Authority, at the same time that the Palestinian Authority is committed to cooperating in coordinating security with Israel. So what's happened as a result of seeing a deterioration in the situation in the West Bank with expanding Israeli settlements and settler violence protected by the army is that the Palestinian Authority and Mr. Abbas himself has no legitimacy. They are seen as collaborators with the occupation, protecting settlers and not providing any protection for Palestinians. So that's how he's managed to delegitimize Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. At the same time, he has enabled Hamas to continue to rule, weakened Hamas each time, but funded them through Qatari money and keeping them in this cage, bribing them all the time that we're going to open up and give you jobs. And as of the government before Netanyahu, the government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid actually opened Gaza for the first time in 16 years and allowed 17,000 workers from Gaza to work in Israel. By the way, most of those workers are trapped in Israel now. They couldn't get back to Gaza. Some of them are in the Dheisheh refugee camp south of Bethlehem. Some of them have been arrested by Israel as being, just wondering, what do we do with these Palestinians from Gaza when Gaza is being bombed? But this is what strategy of Netanyahu has been implemented over the last years in order to say to the world and to the Israeli public, we have no partner. Hamas is dedicated to our destruction. Abbas is corrupt and illegitimate and supports terrorism. The pay-to-slay policy that the Palestinian Authority pays Palestinian prisoners. So they've delegitimized them, and Netanyahu not only convinced the world that there's no reason or no way to negotiate with the Palestinians, we have impunity from the world, he's convinced the Israeli public that there's no partner. So the Palestinian issue has been removed from the political agenda. We had 5 rounds of elections. The issue of Palestine was never in the elections.
I want to come back to how Israel got it so wrong. I mean, the presumption was that this was certainly, if we go back to 10 years ago, that Hamas in some way wanted legitimacy, and it was moving away from this position of trying to destroy Israel and the armed struggle. And initially, Hamas's position is that the armed struggle is the only legitimate way of opposing the occupation. That was the sole way of doing it. But Hamas, if you go back in the late 2000s, the late noughties rather, and then you go in 2011, 2012. The idea was that it was more pragmatic, that it wanted legitimacy, it wanted to be seen as the leader of the Palestinian people, and that there might be some way forward.
Yeah, I think Hamas did go through that. My reading of it is that the burden of governance weighed heavily on them, and they went through a process of becoming more pragmatic, or seemingly becoming more pragmatic, under extraordinary Egyptian pressure. In 2018, I think it was, they actually modified their covenant. They removed the explicit anti-Semitism from it. And they also stated that they would accept a Palestinian state in the 1967 borders in the lands occupied by Israel in 67 without recognizing Israel, without making peace with Israel. But they also demanded the right of return of all refugees to their original homes, which meant flooding Israel with additional Palestinians and essentially making Israel a binational state, not a Jewish state. That was, of course, never acceptable to Israel, but it signaled to the international community that we are not meeting what were called the quartet conditions. There were 3 conditions issued by the quartet. The quartet was created by George W. Bush, including the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations. Basically, it was a mechanism designed back in 2003, I think, which launched the roadmap. You might remember that Tony Blair was the head of the quartet for a period of time. The quartet conditions were that Hamas recognized the Oslo agreements, that Hamas recognized Israel, and Hamas denounced the armed struggle. So Hamas refused to do all 3 of them. I always believed that the first 2 conditions were irrelevant, recognizing Oslo and recognizing Israel. The only important condition was saying that we would not engage in violence as long as there was a chance for substantive negotiations. And that's the condition that should have been put on Hamas. Most of the nations that recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization, all the countries of the European Union, including the UK when it was part of the European Union, the United States and Canada and Australia and all, have refused to engage with Hamas because it's designated as a terrorist organization. And Hamas sought legitimacy. They were elected democratically and didn't understand why the Western world that honors and forces democracy on all kinds of nations refused to recognize the democratic will of the Palestinian people when they elected a majority to run the parliament and form a government. But I think that that disappeared over the last couple of years.
There's quite a lot of analysis that suggests that there was a split between the political leadership, which is largely based in Doha and some in Beirut, and the military leadership, which of course is based in Gaza. Do you subscribe to that? I'm thinking in particular.
No, I think that the split was actually between the outside leadership and the inside leadership. My sense was that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, who was freed in the Shalit agreement, was actually seeking to have Gaza open up and a long-term ceasefire. My understanding is that there was interest on his part, and it was the more radical elements in Hamas who live the life of luxury and don't suffer the reality of Gaza who were taking the more hard line. I don't know if any of us are right in this analysis. That's the way that I saw it. My discussions with people in Gaza was on the more pragmatic track, but there was total resistance to Israel doing that. Resistance to Israel opening up Gaza, resistance of Israel to engaging in a long-term ceasefire. Netanyahu was quite satisfied with the strategy that he thought was working. It had, for him, removed the Palestinian issue from the agenda, and there would be no international pressure on Israel to change the status of the West Bank.
Gershon, you must be very worried that this cycle just is going to get worse and worse. I mean, you've written that, Hamas is ready to die. They always choose when and how to use violence. Many of their elite fighters are from bereaved families. They fight for Palestine, for Allah, for Islam, because of their desire for revenge. And that's obviously not going to go away in the short term.
Yeah, even Ghazi Hamad, who I've had very difficult conversations with, mostly late at night over the last 2 weeks, when I have pleaded with him to do the right thing and reminded him that it's against the Quran, it's against Islam to attack women and children and elderly people, it's against the Quran to hold them as hostages, and I appealed to him to do the right thing, and we have moved into unpleasant talk about terrorism and things like that. He has gone back and responded, when I said to him, Hamas is finished. There's simply no scenario where Hamas is going to be in place at the end of the day. And he would come back to me and said, listen, we're not afraid to die. We're not afraid to die. And this is not a slogan. This is very difficult for us to understand, but their theology, which I believe is a distortion of Islam, not what Islam is really about, but their distorted view of Islam is that our period that we're alive on this earth is short and insignificant. What's important is eternal life in paradise. And in their distorted view of Islam, the most assured way of getting into paradise is by being a martyr for Palestine, for Islam, for Al-Aqsa. In other words, killing a Jew in Palestine becoming a martyr is your way to get into paradise, and that's much more important than the life you live on this planet.
Okay, I want to expand the conversation and look at a bit about the international dimension, both how things might change within the Arab world. Huge amount of popular pressure on Arab leadership who might have different opinions to their own, to the feeling in the streets. But let's take a question from Diane Cook that's along these lines, and I think that relates more to Western approaches. Go ahead, Diane. Go on.
Gershon, I thought your opening remarks underline just how serious, if that's the right word, this is for each side, for Israelis and for Palestinians, going right back to those events in the 1940s. Do you think that the Western world in particular understands the depth of that, and that this is perhaps different from things that we've seen over the last, say, 20 years? And in particular, I guess, in the US.
Yeah.
And does that mean that, we in the West need to change our posture?
What do you mean by that, Diane? And when you say change our posture?
I think a lot of people feel, certainly if you take in Britain, our Prime Minister, really hard on supporting Israel. But actually what happens in the country is that people are sitting here thinking, well, actually, what about what's been happening in the Gaza Strip for so long? And what about the other side? Not making any, saying one side is better than the other, and not just saying both sides have got fault, but just looking at the facts on the ground. And that doesn't seem to be reflected in what politicians are saying or their knee-jerk reaction.
So I think, first of all, it's too soon, and events are unfolding in real time for us to really understand what the consequences of this are going to be locally or internationally. I can't guess forward what might emerge and what the people here are going to be feeling and thinking on the day after tomorrow. I think it is more than necessary for the international community to come back here and relook at the fact that they've written off Israel and Palestine for too long, the fact that they have given Israel impunity to do what it's done for too long, the fact that speaking about a two-state solution is not making it happen when you ignore the realities on the ground, when you fail to recognize the total lack of symmetry in the conflict, and don't confront that head on and try to create a more balanced playing field. So I think there needs to be a very strong reevaluation of international policy. I think that in particular, the United Kingdom bears direct responsibility for events that have unfolded here in the last 100 years, going back to the Balfour Declaration and going back to the British Mandate. And I think that the one-sided policy of the United Kingdom is not acceptable. And I think it should be changed. I think that I'm not a big expert on British politics, but it seems to me that there will not be a conservative government after the next round of elections. That seems pretty likely. And there's possibly, I've spoken to some of the people in the Labour Party there who have a much more balanced approach toward Israel and Palestine. And maybe there will be a change of government in London the next time you folks have elections. I think that the United States, there have been statements that President Biden is the most Zionist president in history. And I think that many Jews who supported Trump in the past are now reevaluating their support and will support Biden in the upcoming elections because of all the support that Biden has provided Israel. But I think that the American viewpoint on the region right now is based primarily on understanding that what happened to Israel is an existential threat to Israel, because when Israel's defenses collapsed so easily, it opened up the chances of exploits by Iran and Hezbollah and other proxies of Iran. And while the Palestinians have never been an existential threat to Israel, those the impression of Israel collapsing, Israel not being able to defend itself, is an existential threat. I think the sending of 2 aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean is a very clear message from the United States that if Hezbollah attempts to really enter the war, not the skirmishes that we're seeing on the border now, but if they point their 200,000 missiles at Israel, that the response will come from the United States. Now, in a strange way, that has made Israel no longer independent in making decisions on its own defense. Israel is dependent now on the United States directly, and that means that in the war room right now, there's either the physical presence of an American general or the spiritual presence of an American general there who's limiting any free action that Israel might have in any of these arenas, whether it be Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, or Iran. Israel is not independent in making these decisions now. But there's no doubt that the Americans are going to have a more balanced posture on the Palestinian issue, that they cannot go on being the attorney general for Israel in negotiations. In fact, they should not be leading any future negotiations. That should be focused on the region, in the neighborhood, with American support, with British support and European support. But this really has to be a process that will be led here in the region, in the neighborhood, with the Arab countries that have peace with Israel and Arab countries that would like to have peace with Israel, like Saudi Arabia. That's where we can create regional stability and hopefully regional prosperity, a good life for people who are living here.
Gershon, I think you were saying that you said to Hamas that you can no longer exist. You've sort of defeated yourselves, but essentially they have won a victory in one way. They've put as we've just been discussing, they've put the Palestinian question, the future of the state, front and central in international affairs. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, those states that had a rapprochement with Israel, did so without actually providing anything for the Palestinians. That's no longer the case. And then on top of that, you have Iran saying, look, we're with the Palestinians. It's the Arab states are no longer with you. You can trust us, trust Hezbollah, and that'll you'll be better off. So the Arab leadership are now under huge pressure, and that's really a victory that Hamas has won.
Right. I think that anyone who heard the speech of King Abdullah at the recent Cairo summit heard very strong words from King Abdullah against Israel, kind of things that he's never said before about the human rights violations, the Palestinian lives matter less than Israeli lives. And he was very direct. Queen Rania last night on Christian Amanpour on CNN said the same thing in very strong words. And it's not words that people in the Arab world are used to hearing from the leaders of Jordan. President Sisi, who's a very strong ally of Israel, and maybe his own survival of his regime is dependent upon the relation with Israel, has had also very harsh words against Israel. These regimes are threatened if there's destabilization of Palestine in general and the continuation of civilian deaths in Gaza and in the West Bank. Let's not forget, in the last 2 weeks, there's been about 100 Palestinians killed in the West Bank by the Israeli army and Israeli settlers who have gone wild. Israeli Palestinian citizens are at threat today by Israeli citizens who are seeking revenge and see them as identifying with the army, with the enemy. So it's a very explosive situation here. And we're going to need for the international community, who are the allies of Israel, to be hard with Israel. The old saying that good friends don't let their friends drive drunk. Well, we need someone to take the steering wheel away when Israel is steering us in the wrong direction.
Gershon, we've got a talk coming up with Nicholas Blandford in Beirut next week. He's an expert on Hezbollah, and we'll be looking at that key question. What is the risk of this conflict spreading?
It's a very big risk. A war could open on the northern front tomorrow morning. I mean, Hezbollah and its proxies have been shooting mostly anti-tank rockets over to the Israeli border. The civilian communities all along the Lebanese border have been vacated. There are no civilians there except people necessary to take care of animals that are in the farms. There's a lot of tension. The Israelis have responded with, you call it disproportional force, against every attack coming over the Lebanese border, but they have killed probably 30 or 40 Hezbollah soldiers in the last 2 weeks in retaliatory attacks when there are rockets that are fired over into Israel. If one of those rocket attacks from Hezbollah hits a school or hits a bus or does a lot of damage, not just, physical damage to property, but people are actually killed, that could launch another war in the northern border. And that will be much more lethal than the battle in Gaza, because Hezbollah is a lot stronger than Hamas and has a lot more firepower than Hamas. And it could also bring in Iran to the equation and then bring in the Americans. I mean, can spin out of control to a world war. So I think that we're all being very careful not to allow that to happen.
Yeah. Well, our talk's almost coming to an end. If anyone's got an additional question, please do put it down very quickly now in the Q&A box. We've got just another 4 minutes to go. I'm going to read something that Richard Murphy, who's a regular listener, has sent in. Labour's Yasmin Qureshi says she's received an email from a constituent from with a family in Gaza. As she reads it out, the Commons falls silent. The email reads, "My heart can't handle this anymore. We're being massacred, relentlessly bombed. Homes are being destroyed. No water, no food, no electricity." Croatia puts it to Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's questions. "This is collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza for crimes they did not commit. How many more innocent Palestinians must die before this PM calls for a humanitarian ceasefire?" Humanitarian ceasefire aside, no Israeli commander has been found guilty of war crimes ever, have they?
Only within Israeli courts. There have been,
but not war crimes, just and minor.
Crimes. Yeah. No. The war crimes. The officers who were responsible for the massacre that took place in 1956 in the Palestinian village of Kfar Qasim inside of Israel were tried on war crimes. They were, of course, acquitted and released 3 or 4 years later. They didn't serve any real terms. There were other officers who committed crimes in Lebanon who were tried for those crimes. I don't know that they're defined within the Israeli laws as war crimes, but they're war crimes.
Yeah, but no, I can't recall any Israeli big going before the ICC, because that was a recent creation.
No. Israel has protected itself by investigating every action, every killing of civilians, and the international, the ICC has said that these were investigated by Israel's courts and its army. We have no jurisdiction.
Okay. Lastly, just before we wrap up, what's the latest on foreign nationals on the border with Rafah? Gershon, there are several hundred waiting there.
I don't know actually what the number is. I know that the Hamas and others took Thai workers. They took home caretakers from Nepal and the Philippines. I think the numbers are actually quite small. There are a lot of Israelis who are dual nationals. To the best of my experience and knowledge, Hamas doesn't treat any Israeli differently from another Israeli, whether they have a second passport or not. The first 2 women who were released apparently had American passports as well as Israeli passports. The second 2 women who were released only had Israeli passports. I don't think it really matters. This was someone piped this up and hyped it and made it into an argument that Israelis could argue amongst themselves about, of Israelis of different status. Best of my knowledge, Hamas doesn't make that differentiation. Hamas has said that foreign nationals who are not part of the conflict would be released at the first possible moment. That's security.
Okay. My question was actually about Gaza and about Palestinian dual nationals on the border.
My understanding was that everyone was in agreement that Palestinians in Gaza or other foreign nationals who are not Palestinians who hold foreign passports would be allowed to leave. And I don't know why that's not happening. The Egyptians have said that they would allow it. The Israelis said they would allow it. And Hamas said that they would allow it. But apparently it's not happening.
Yeah, okay. I think that's it, everyone. Gershon, this has been fantastic. Your time is also valuable. I know you're very, very busy at this time doing what you can to highlight what needs to be highlighted. Thank you very much in time, and I hope we get to see you before long. We cancelled our tour to Israel and Palestine before these events happened, but also in the knowledge that things are becoming more and more difficult. We had no idea that something like this would unleash. But thank you very much indeed, Gershon.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, everyone. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thank you.